My son treated me no differently than a hired servant right in the middle of a lavish party, one funded entirely by my own money. But when the CEO they were so desperate to impress showed up and addressed me with just one word, boss, that glittering evening instantly collapsed into humiliation. I still remember that night vividly. It was around 8 o'clock, at the house on 12 Willow Creek, a 2-story place my son, Martin, had just remodeled to show off to his colleagues. The dining room sparkled under a crystal chandelier, its light bouncing off the long, white-clothed table where crystal glasses and neatly arranged silverware gleamed. The hum of conversations, the scrape of chairs, the clinking of glasses, all of it created a noisy, unfamiliar backdrop. I am George. Once, I was George, the man of a complete family, a husband, a father. But now, within these very walls, the name I hear most often is just Old George from my son's lips, or worse, nothing more than the help in the eyes of the guests seated around that glowing table. Since the day Eleanor, my wife, passed away, the house that had once been filled with laughter in the suburbs had become nothing but silence. I never got used to living alone. Martin, my son, had told me, "Dad, come live with us. It'll be easier for you, and the little one will keep you company." I agreed, thinking closeness might ease my grief, but I was wrong. From the very first days after moving in, my place in this house was arranged. A small room at the end of the hall, once a storage closet, barely big enough for a single bed and a wobbly wooden dresser. I didn't complain, thinking it was only temporary, but slowly tasks began piling on me, driving my grandson to school, mowing the lawn, watching the house, cooking dinner. What started as polite requests became orders. Dad turned into Old George in Martin's moments of irritation until the nickname stuck as part of daily life. And that evening, under the shimmering chandelier, I carried out the tray of beef stew and red wine. It was the dish I'd spent the entire afternoon marinating and tending to over the stove. I placed it in the center of the table, steam rising in rich curls. For a brief moment, every eye turned toward the dish, and toward me, the one who had carried it out. But the stares weren't thankful. They were the familiar glances reserved for a servant. Before I could even draw a breath of relief, Martin's voice cut through the formal air. "Dad, we're short on silverware for the guests. Please bring some more." His tone wasn't a request, it was an order, sharp and unceremonious. Loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, clear enough to define exactly who I was at that party. The atmosphere at the dinner table suddenly dropped. The murmurs of conversation died out, replaced by an awkward silence. Every eye in the room, strangers and acquaintances alike, turned toward me. They looked at me as if I were nothing more than a servant, a hired hand in my own home. I noticed a few older guests glance at each other, their eyes betraying discomfort. Perhaps they sensed something was off, but they quickly looked away, unwilling to intrude on family matters. I knew what they were thinking. I knew exactly what Martin wanted them to think. This dinner was Martin's idea, a chance to host a few colleagues from his company and, at the same time, show off his newly renovated house. The dining room sparkled under the chandelier, the long table covered with a white cloth, crystal glasses lined up perfectly. I sat quietly at one end of the table, reminding myself that I would remain silent through the entire evening. Martin rose to his feet, his voice brimming with excitement. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight we celebrate not only the new house, but also the chance to raise a glass together. And seated right next to me is my father-in-law, Charles. He's the one who's given me advice, opened doors, and created opportunities so that I could get where I am today." Applause broke out, and every gaze shifted toward Charles. He leaned back slightly, lifted his glass of wine, his face full of smug pride. The chorus of cheers blended with loud laughter. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice sweet as honey but sharp as a blade hidden behind her smile. "That's right. Your father is the real pride of this family, the one who's brought honor to us all." Laughter, clinking glasses, and cheers filled the room, drowning out every other sound. Some guests even added, "How lucky to have such a wonderful father-in-law." In that moment, I was still seated there, yet I might as well have been invisible. No one mentioned me. Not a single eye turned my way, even though this very house they toasted was paid for with the savings of my entire life. I had sold my suburban home, the one filled with memories of Eleanor and me, to give Martin the money so he and his family could have a better start. And now, in this very house, the one receiving all the praise was Charles, while I was nothing more than a shadow, silently clearing away empty dishes. I looked at the sparkling crystal glass in front of him, then down at my own plain water glass, dim and forgotten in the shadows. That contrast said it all. I was no longer George the husband, the father, but Old Man George, a servant at my own dinner party. I placed the last dish on the table, my task completed. I meant to find some empty spot, a little chair in the corner where I could at least sit down, so I wouldn't remain standing like some frozen statue in the middle of the dining room. But Martin blocked me. He didn't speak a word, he simply raised his hand and pointed toward a far corner. There, a lone chair sat against the wall, half hidden behind a potted plant. "Sit there, Dad, don't disturb anyone." His voice was the same as always, cold, commanding. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. I knew my place. Quietly, I walked toward that corner seat and sat down, alone. I felt like an afterthought, an object without a name, out of place in this world. I watched the glowing faces, the bright smiles around the table, and felt myself cut off from it all, an invisible boundary drawn clear as day. I lifted my eyes and by chance met Charles's gaze as he raised his glass. His lips curved into a half-smile, laced with meaning and triumph, as his eyes swept over me. That look said everything. "You see, this is where you belong." The whole table burst into laughter again. Their laughter echoed in my ears, each sound like a blade cutting into my heart. I felt as if I were being swallowed whole by a wave of disgrace, sinking deeper into a pit of humiliation. Bitterness burned hot in my throat, rising until it nearly choked me. But all I could do was remain silent, gripping my hands tightly beneath the table. I knew there was nothing I could do, at least not now. All I could do was wait for another moment. That laughter that night turned out to be the warning bell of a truth the family never imagined would come. Half the dinner had already passed, the table still alive with chatter and laughter. I bent down, carrying out the tray of desserts I had just arranged in the kitchen. The sweet, warm scent of fresh apple pie filled the air, the crisp crust mingling with the fragrance of cinnamon. I set the tray carefully on the table, pouring hot coffee into the porcelain cups. A female guest, perhaps one of Martin's new colleagues, turned politely toward me and asked, "And who might you be? The household help?" The table fell silent for a beat, then every eye shifted toward Martin. He still had his arm draped around Mr. Charles let out a dry chuckle and shrugged. "Oh, that's my father. At home, he helps out with kitchen work. He's great at cooking, so we don't need to hire anyone." A burst of laughter followed. Some covered their mouths, others laughed outright. I stood there, my hand still on the tray handle, feeling the blood rush to my face. Vanessa chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet but dripping with mockery. "That's right, Daddy George is a wonderful cook. At least he's useful around the house, saves us a fortune on hiring a private chef." She winked at a few of the other women at the table, and once again the laughter rippled through the room. I froze, my chest tight. In this very house, the one I had bought with the savings of a lifetime, I was being introduced as little more than hired help, turned into a punchline for their amusement. Then one of the guests, an older gentleman I didn't know, raised his glass, took a small sip of wine, and said something that sounded polite but carried a cruelty that cut to the bone. Indeed, every family needs someone to stand at the helm, with career and reputation, and someone else to take care of things in the background. Each has their role, after all. He hadn't named me directly, but his eyes and his tone said everything. The others nodded in agreement, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I bent down, not out of humility, but to hide the face burning with shame and fury. Maybe a chopstick had just fallen, or maybe I only needed an excuse to avoid their stares. My blood still pounded hot in my face, my ears ringing with their mocking laughter and poisonous words. I fought with everything in me not to let the anger boil over. I knew I couldn't react. Not yet. A sigh escaped me before I even realized it. I gathered the heavy stack of dirty dishes, weighed down not only by porcelain but by the cruelty of their words, by the contempt pressing hard against my chest. I carried them quickly into the kitchen, desperate for a corner to escape their eyes and voices. I switched on the dishwasher. The noisy whirring began the rush of water, the churn of the motor trying its best to drown out the echoes of their laughter, and scorn spilling in from the living room. I scrubbed each plate, each bowl, grinding the sponge hard against porcelain, as if I could scrub away the shame clinging to me. When I lifted my head from the sink, my eyes happened to drift past the little kitchen window, out into the living room. That's when I caught the gaze of a stranger. He was a middle-aged man, sitting slightly out of view, staring straight at me. His look wasn't the contempt I'd grown used to, nor the ordinary curiosity of a guest. It felt as though he'd just recognized something deeply familiar. An intent, layered gaze that startled me for a moment. He didn't smile. He just looked. And in that instant, it felt as if an invisible thread had been tied back together between two entirely different worlds. The party eventually wound down. The noise of cars faded, and silence settled over the house. Martin and Vanessa had gone upstairs, probably still discussing the success of the evening. I, however, couldn't sleep right away. The bitterness in my chest and the strange look from that guest lingered, haunting me. I didn't want to face the emptiness of the cold living room, so I decided to go down to the basement, where I kept the things no one wanted to see, partly to tidy up, partly to search for a shred of peace in my loneliness. The dim glow of the old filament bulb barely lit the stairs leading into the damp storage room, heavy with the smell of dust and mildew. In a dark corner, I stumbled upon some cartons so old they'd yellowed, their thick layer of dust like a blanket of time. They'd been sitting there for ages, untouched. I knew what was inside pieces of my life my children had tried to bury. I brushed the thick dust from one of the boxes, revealing the name George Miller scrawled in faded marker. I lifted the lid. Inside lay the relics of my once brilliant career. Certificates yellowed with age, dusty picture frames, forgotten company files, tattered folders, everything piled carelessly together, stripped of respect, like discarded objects no one wanted anymore. They lay still, carrying a past I had once been so proud of. My hands trembled. I picked up an old picture frame. In the photo, I was shaking hands with the CEO of a prestigious corporation years ago. My smile was bright, full of pride, my eyes shining with the confidence of a successful man. My hair was still black then, my face not yet carved with the lines of worry. That was me back then. A sharp ache pierced my heart. Memories came rushing back like a slow-motion film. I remembered standing in grand auditoriums, the stage lights on me, my voice resonating as I spoke confidently before hundreds of employees, the admiring eyes, and the respect I once commanded from colleagues and partners. I remembered the crucial meetings, the big decisions that changed an entire industry. Those were the days when I was the boss. Mr. Miller, the man everyone looked up to and sought out. Now I'm just this old man standing quietly in a damp basement or in a cold kitchen, dismissed by my own children, spoken to like a servant, hidden away along with these outdated relics. The gulf between my glorious past and my lonely, forgotten present is so vast it twists my heart. My throat feels dry, as if someone is squeezing it shut. A hot tear threatens to fall, but I force myself to hold it back. Suddenly the basement door swung open. Light from the hallway spilled in, making me squint. Martin stood there, his expression indifferent. His eyes flicked over me, then settled on the old file folder in my hands. He gave a thin, mocking smile. "You're still holding on to that stuff?" he said, his tone treating it like a worthless trinket. "Throw it out. The past can't feed anyone. It just clutters up the house." He spoke as though I were a child clutching a broken toy. I looked up at my son, meeting his eyes. A spark flickered in mine, but I kept my voice calm, almost a whisper, just loud enough in the stillness of the basement. "Some things can't be measured by money, son." I didn't argue, didn't offer explanations. Just one sentence enough to state my view, enough to show a piece of the man Martin had forgotten. Then I lowered my eyes to the old photograph again. My trembling hands gripped the frame as though it held the last fragment of my dignity, the last remnant of the man I used to be. Martin shrugged without answering. Maybe he didn't understand, or maybe he just didn't want to. He turned his back and started to walk away, his footsteps scraping softly against the cement floor. At that very moment, the phone in my pocket vibrated, a faint buzzing sound, but enough to startle me, and enough to pull Martin's attention back. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was Andrew. Andrew, my former assistant, who had worked with me many years ago. I froze, my eyes darting toward Martin, who was only a few steps away, not completely gone yet. A storm of emotions tore through me. Andrew, why was he calling me now? Could this be a beginning or just a cruel coincidence? The vibration in my pocket felt like a thunderclap in my ears, especially with Martin standing so close. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to look calm. Martin frowned at me, suspicion flickering in his eyes as if to ask, "Who's calling you at this hour?" Quickly, I slid the phone out before he could see the number on the screen. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice low and cautious, careful not to let Martin catch a single word. Andrew's voice came through, familiar yet filled with respect and eagerness. "Boss," he said warmly, "tomorrow at 9 a.m., the signing of the strategic contract between Pinnacle and the new partner is set. Mrs. Victoria knows you've been working remotely, staying out of the spotlight, serving as senior advisor and strategic guide. For that reason, she's decided to personally come to your residence to sign and to discuss the upcoming roadmap." He spoke in a rush, not giving me a chance to interrupt. "Everything's ready, sir. It's been a long time since we met in person. Have you been well?" I exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and weight pressing on my chest. Emotions I couldn't quite name rose within me. After so many years of working in silence, with no one truly knowing the role I played, another chance had come. And right here, in the very house where I was treated as nothing, I only murmured, "Thank you, Andrew, I'm fine." Then I quickly hung up, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and forced myself to act natural. Martin was still standing there, staring at me with suspicion in his eyes, but I ignored him. I couldn't let him know what was happening. It would only make their little game more interesting. That evening, I stayed quietly in the kitchen, finishing up the cleaning. From the living room, the sharp ring of the landline broke the silence. A long chime, then Vanessa picked up. Moments later, I heard voices carrying back toward me, Martin and Vanessa talking excitedly, their tones bubbling over with enthusiasm, almost shouting. They had no idea I was listening, or perhaps they simply didn't care. "Did you hear that call, Vanessa?" Martin's voice was practically bursting with excitement, his joy impossible to hide. "It was Mrs. Victoria's assistant confirming. She's coming here tomorrow in person to meet and to discuss the partnership project. He said this is a very important partner of Pinnacle, and she wants to have a private meeting right here in our home." Martin was nearly bouncing with glee. "This is our golden chance to impress her. We'll have Grandpa Charles sit in, play the role of the shield of honor. She'll respect him, and it'll definitely work to our advantage." He spoke as if he had everything perfectly planned, completely unaware that the CEO was coming for a very different reason, and that his assumption was one giant misunderstanding. Martin believed the visit was meant for his company. The information he'd received was simply that Victoria would meet with an important partner at his house. He automatically assumed that partner was him, and that Charles would help him score points in front of her. Completely blinded by his own self-importance, he was living inside a bubble of pure arrogance. Vanessa chimed in, her voice full of confidence and pride. "That's right, the CEO will respect Grandpa's reputation. He has far more social experience than any of us. And as for Dad George..." She paused briefly, as if to further emphasize the difference between the two men and my place in this house. "Just let him handle the cooking. Don't let him set foot in the living room and embarrass the family. The dinner has to be absolutely perfect, but Dad George should stay in the kitchen." I heard every single word, every syllable, my heart pounding harder with each one. A bitter yet almost comical feeling welled up inside me, mixed with the sharpest sense of irony. They were waiting for the very CEO who was about to sign a contract with me with George Miller, the boss of Andrew, Pinnacle's senior advisor who had chosen to remain in the shadows. They thought this was Charles's chance to boost Martin's company, but in reality, they were anticipating a meeting where I would be the central figure. What a cruel farce! A stage play I never imagined myself part of, yet here I was, cast as the silent spectator. And yet, within that uneasy mix of anger and dark amusement, something stronger began to take shape inside me. I realized this was my moment. This was the time to make a decision, one that would change my life, and perhaps the lives of everyone in this family. I could no longer keep retreating. I could no longer accept humiliation. From now on, I would not play their game by their rules. Martin suddenly walked into the kitchen, pointing his finger straight at me, his voice sharp with command and humiliation, not even bothering to hide it, though I knew there were still guests sitting in the living room. Tomorrow, you just focus on cooking and do it properly. And don't you dare step into the living room. I don't want any incidents. Do you understand me? He asked, as if stamping his authority down once more. I swallowed the fury rising in me. I didn't answer. I could not believe my own son would speak to me that way, so openly, so degradingly, over a ridiculous misunderstanding. But behind my calm eyes, in my pounding chest, a fierce resolve had begun to take root. I would no longer be the man confined to the kitchen. I would no longer be their servant. Tomorrow, everything would change. Everything had to change. That night I didn't sleep. Martin's words still echoed in my ears, but now they weren't daggers piercing me anymore. They were fire, igniting a determination long buried. I knew it was time to change. Today could not be like all the days before. I looked at the suit hanging over the chair. It was no longer just clothing. It was armor I would put on to face a battle. The next morning, as soon as I stepped out of my room, Vanessa appeared before me with a stern look, holding a sheet of paper. "Dad George," she said, her tone as commanding as ever, no different from any other day. "Here's the list of household tasks for tonight's dinner." I took the paper from her. On it was a long, detailed list. Shopping for ingredients, preparing an elaborate main course, carefully decorating, and finally, cleaning and setting up the living room to look grand and elegant for the important CEO. My fingers trembled slightly as I gripped the sheet, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the inner tension, the restraint before an explosion. Still, I said nothing in response. I only gave a vague nod, as if I had agreed. I let them think I was still the same old George they believed they knew. From the kitchen, I could hear Martin in the living room. He was standing in the middle of the room, confidently rehearsing his introduction over and over again, preparing to flatter his grandfather Charles in front of the important guests who were about to arrive. His voice echoed with pride about his upcoming performance, about how he would use Charles to impress the CEO of Pinnacle. He kept tweaking every word, every gesture, as if he were preparing for a grand play, a play where he imagined himself as both the director and the leading actor, while I was nothing more than an unnamed extra behind the curtain. I remembered when Martin used to practice his first words and first steps, but back then it was for me to hear, for me to be proud. He would often run into my arms after every school recital, his eyes sparkling with admiration whenever I praised him. That sparkle was gone now, replaced with indifference. As Vanessa walked past the kitchen, she suddenly stopped. Cutting across Martin's rehearsal, she turned to remind me, still standing there with the list in my hand. "Oh, Dad George, don't forget to scrub the floors until they shine. Tonight everything has to be perfect. You know the CEO is very particular." Her tone was as imposing as ever, carrying no respect, no request, just an order. She spoke as though she were addressing a forgetful servant. I stayed silent, lowered my head, and glanced over the list again, like a true servant trying to memorize every detail. I went to the market. The same familiar road I walked every morning, but today my heart was heavier than usual, not because of the weight of the groceries, but because of the weight of the words, the deceit I was about to face. Carrying the heavy bags back home, I stepped inside and immediately heard Martin on the phone with his friends. His tone was full of conceit, seeping through the half-closed kitchen door. "My father's useless. He's never accomplished anything big. His whole life has been stuck in the kitchen. But luckily, I have my grandfather, Charles, a brilliant man who gave me the position I have today, who opened up such amazing connections for me." Each word cut into my ears. I stopped in the hallway, my grip tightening on the grocery handles until my knuckles turned white. All the bottled-up humiliation and bitterness rose inside me, pressing harder than ever. The spark of anger that had smoldered since last night now flared up, hotter than ever before. My chest felt like it would explode. I closed my eyes. For a fleeting second, I saw little Martin again, his tiny hand clutching mine as I taught him to dribble a basketball, his eyes shining when I told him stories about my work. "Dad, you're a superhero," he once said. "You can do anything." Now that superhero was nothing but a useless man in the kitchen. And still, I kept silent. Not a sound. I walked past the living room. Grandfather Charles sat in the place of honor, just like at the last gathering, surrounded by Martin and Vanessa. He was rambling on and on about his glorious past, stories I knew all too well how much of them were truth, and how much were lies. Martin sat by his side, nodding in agreement, his eyes glowing with belief in every word Charles said. We all sat there, listening, laughing, playing the part of a perfectly happy family. It was a cruel sight, a play I had grown sick of. Too fake, too familiar. I looked at them, then lowered my head and slipped quickly into my own room. I couldn't face that harsh contrast another second. I needed my own space, time to think, time to prepare for the final act of this play. Late at night, when everyone had gone to bed and the house was swallowed in absolute silence, I quietly opened the wardrobe. Inside hung an old but still respectable suit, the one I used to wear on important occasions, at award ceremonies, at contract signings. It had been lying there for years, alongside other keepsakes in a damp storage room, waiting for the day it would be called back into use. I carefully pulled it out and pressed each wrinkle with the iron, stroke by stroke. Every line I smoothed wasn't just on the fabric, it was as if I were smoothing out the heaviness, the hurt in my heart. I thought of Martin as a boy, of the dreams I once held for him, of the promises I made that I would always be his source of pride. And then I thought of the Martin of today, how he treated me, the contempt he had for his own father. This preparation wasn't for them, it was to face them. Afterward, I hung the suit neatly on the chair across from my bed. That act wasn't just preparation for a meeting tomorrow. It was a symbol, a declaration that I was ready for a great change in my life. A return. An affirmation. I didn't sleep last night. My eyes stayed fixed on the suit hanging from the chair, as if it were a countdown clock to a defining moment, a final battle. At dawn, as the first light crept in, I rose with iron resolve. No more torment. No more doubt or fear. I had made my choice. This wasn't just a decision, it was liberation, a vow to myself. On the morning of the important banquet, the house grew noisy again with hurried footsteps and clattering objects. I heard Vanessa rush into the kitchen. "Dad, George!" Her voice carried annoyance, but suddenly dipped with a touch of panic. "Why haven't you started cooking? The banquet tonight. What are you planning?" I imagined her staring at the bare kitchen, without a single sign of food preparation. Panic was seeping into her tone. Moments later came Martin's heavy footsteps. He walked in, glanced at the empty kitchen, then turned to me, his voice sharp with anger, though tinged with worry and disbelief. "What the hell are you doing? The CEO is coming tonight. All you need to do is handle the cooking. Don't you dare step into the living room and embarrass us. Do you even realize how important this evening is? It could decide the future of my company." His words lashed out in fury, but in his eyes I saw something else, fear. Fear of a scenario spinning out of his control. I stood there in silence. I didn't answer him. There was nothing left to say, words had lost all meaning. I lifted my head and looked Martin straight in the eyes. My gaze no longer carried the resignation, the fatigue, or the meekness he was used to. Instead, it held calm, steadiness, and something new, something that startled him. For the first time, he couldn't read me. I held his gaze for a moment, as if etching it into memory, imprinting the image of a different George. Then I turned and walked into my room. I shut the door gently but firmly. The small click echoed like the closing of a chapter. Behind me, Martin and Vanessa froze in the kitchen, their faces twisted with anger and confusion. They couldn't understand. Inside my room, everything was ready. I quickly packed the important documents into an old but sturdy leather briefcase, contracts, strategic reports I had long prepared, the very things Andrew had mentioned the night before, things that would reshape the course of my life. I took the freshly pressed suit, slid into it carefully. Button by button, hem by hem, I felt as though I were slipping back into a forgotten version of myself, donning a new skin, stronger, sharper. I stood before the mirror, staring at the man reflected back. He was no longer the tired, submissive old man I had seen for so many years. My eyes were entirely different now, no weariness, no humiliation. Instead, confidence, composure, and a quiet pride long buried. I had returned. George Miller had returned not as a memory, but here, alive, in this very moment. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, a gentle smile appeared on my lips. Outside, I could hear Martin and Vanessa rushing about, frantically rearranging everything. The hurried footsteps, the scraping of furniture, the clipped voices filled the air. They were hanging up Martin's company's oversized backdrop on the living room wall, adjusting chairs, and shoving things around in a desperate attempt to make the place look as elegant and professional as possible. They still believed Charles was their trump card. They still believed this party belonged to them. They had no idea about George's change of heart, the very man they had just scolded minutes earlier. They still thought I would be tucked away in the kitchen, quietly finishing my role, only to slip out of sight once the guests arrived. Silently, I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the room. I headed straight to the front door, my posture calm, composed so different from the defeated figure I had always been. Each step carried resolve, each step a statement. I opened the door. A cool draft swept in, carrying the scent of dried leaves, of nightfall approaching, and of a new beginning. The door clicked shut behind me, firm and final. That small sound marked the end of a long season of endurance. I stepped outside and quickly made my way to the car, waiting a short distance away. Andrew was there, already waiting. I needed a quiet place, a temporary office he had arranged where I could review every document one last time before facing CEO Victoria. I would return, at the exact moment it mattered. That evening, as I sat in that temporary office, carefully checking each line of the contract, my mind still pictured the scene inside the old house. By then, the guests must have been arriving, one group after another. The family's living room would now be gaudily decorated, with Martin's company backdrop glaringly displayed as a bold statement of his supposed success. Crystal chandeliers blazing, smooth jazz spilling from an expensive sound system, everything arranged with meticulous care to create an air of grandeur and importance. They wanted perfection, a shimmering facade to hide the truth. I pictured Vanessa, draped in an elegant evening gown, her face heavily made up, greeting each guest with practiced warmth. She pulled Charles forward, dressed in a respectable suit, standing by her side. With pride, she introduced him as the trailblazer who brought fame and fortune to the family. She wanted everyone to believe that Martin's success was owed entirely to Charles's reputation and influence. Every word, every gesture was staged to sell the illusion, a clumsy play whose script I knew by heart. Charles sat in the seat of honor, right in the center, projecting the air of a man of power. He launched into stories about his glory days, his voice heavy with authority, self-importance, and embellishment. The guests clapped politely. At moments, I imagined I could see flickers of doubt in their eyes, hints of disbelief, but those doubts were soon buried under the dazzling false splendor of the evening. Martin moved confidently through the room, chest puffed out, bragging to the guests. With my grandfather here, we've achieved the standing and the connections we enjoy today. He is our benefactor, a respected advisor to the family. He never stopped emphasizing Charles's role while just as deliberately highlighting my absence, as if to redefine the family's true pillar and erase me from the picture entirely. But there was one glaring hole, a flaw they couldn't hide, no matter how hard they tried. The kitchen. While the living room buzzed with laughter, chatter, and boasts, the kitchen remained empty, cold, no food prepared. The heart of a real celebration, the warmth of hearty, home-cooked dishes, was starkly missing. The absence grew more obvious as time passed, and I couldn't help but allow myself a bitter smile. I pictured Vanessa, her carefully painted face starting to crack with worry, trying to cover up the shortfall by endlessly offering wine and trays of crackers and prearranged hors d'oeuvre. She flitted around quickly, forcing a smile, but I could almost see the unease breaking through her mask like a fracture in porcelain. No matter how polished the appetizers, they could never replace a proper feast, and the guests' stomachs were already beginning to rumble in discontent. The discomfort began to spread. A few guests started whispering among themselves, their eyes darting around with suspicion. "So where's the real dinner? Is this just wine and a few snacks?" Unease and doubt thickened in the air, like a dark cloud rolling in to smother all the fake glamour. The whispers grew louder, mingled with dry coughs and loaded glances cast at Martin and Vanessa. People felt deceived, disrespected. Martin grimaced and leaned toward Vanessa, his face betraying irritation, worry, and a hint of fear. "Where's Father? Why isn't he here? He's always useless. He can't ruin everything for us now." He still couldn't believe George, the man he thought of as his servant, could vanish at such a critical moment. In Martin's eyes, I was nothing but irresponsible, never once considering the real reason or the weight of the choice I had made. His arrogance blinded him, turning him into a puppet in his own game. Just as the tension and suspicion reached their peak, when every gaze began searching for an explanation for the missing banquet, when Martin and Vanessa stood on the edge of panic and embarrassment, the doorbell rang sharp, firm, decisive. It was like the closing cue of one act and the opening of another. In the makeshift office, Andrew looked at me. "Boss, it's time." I nodded. I knew. I was ready. My front door opened. A wave of authority and seriousness swept through the room. Victoria, the CEO of Pinnacle Corporation, stepped into the living room with her assistant, her demeanor calm and professional. She didn't smile broadly or flaunt herself. Her very presence was enough to silence the room in a chilling way. The game had begun, and I knew it was no longer their game. I wasn't there in person, but I could picture every detail as if I were replaying a film I had already seen. The crisp chime of the doorbell, the signal, CEO Victoria, entering the living room, carrying an air of authority that starkly contrasted with the shallow showiness Martin and Vanessa were so desperate to project. Her presence swept through the space like a cold wind, extinguishing the last remnants of chatter. Martin, my son, rushed forward eagerly to greet her. I knew exactly what he would do. The wide, somewhat forced smile, the hurried handshake with CEO Victoria. "Welcome, Mrs. Victoria. It is truly an honor for our family to host you," he said, his voice dripping with flattery as he tried to radiate enthusiasm. "Please allow me to introduce my grandfather, Charles. A man of great standing and deep connections, he can help us expand our business network even further." Martin led the introduction with absolute confidence, convinced that everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned, certain that Mrs. Victoria would be won over by Charles's prestige and his company's supposed potential. CEO Victoria shook Charles's hand politely, but I was sure she felt the awkwardness of the exchange, the gap between words and reality. Her eyes showed a flicker of surprise before narrowing slightly. Then, with deliberate calm, she let her gaze sweep the living room, sharp and thorough, as though searching for someone who wasn't there, someone she had truly come to see. Her silence, the slowness of her movements, carried an unspoken weight that made the atmosphere in the room almost unbearable. Finally, she turned back to Martin. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was so steady, stern, and cold that it startled everyone who heard it. "And where is Mr. George Miller?" she asked, each word cutting clearly through the silence. "I came here to meet with him personally." The entire living room suddenly froze. Every murmur, every whisper, every faint clink of glasses stopped dead. It was as if the clock hands had stopped moving. The guests sat stunned, their eyes wide with disbelief, all of them turning at once toward Martin. They had no idea what was happening. George Miller? Who was George Miller? And why would the CEO of Pinnacle come looking for him personally? Martin and Vanessa stood paralyzed. Martin's face drained of color, pale as paper. He couldn't believe, his ears couldn't believe that all of his carefully laid plans had just collapsed with a single question. "Why? Why are you looking for my father?" Martin stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling with confusion and panic. He has nothing to do with this business. He's just..." He cut himself off, not daring to say the word servant in front of the CEO. "He's in the kitchen!" Vanessa jumped in, her voice quivering. "That's right, ma'am. Father George doesn't understand anything about the company." A few guests couldn't hold back and covered their mouths, laughing under their breath harsh little chuckles full of mockery and disdain. Charles, who just moments before had been showered with praise, now turned beet red, staring down at the floor, desperate to avoid the stares now drilling into him. All the prestige he had worked so hard to project collapsed in that instant, crumbling to dust. CEO Victoria remained cold, composed, unyielding. She didn't laugh, didn't show any obvious emotion, but her words cut through the tension like a knife through taut string, sharp and merciless. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes fixed firmly on Martin. "I didn't come here for small talk or social niceties. I came to see my boss, Mr. George Miller." The room fell into a silence so heavy it pressed on every chest. Not a sound could be heard except for Vanessa's weak, muffled sobs as she tried to hide her face. Shame and humiliation engulfed Martin and Charles, as well as every guest forced to witness this pitiful charade. They had been mistaken, terribly, unforgivably mistaken, and now the truth had shattered open. At that very moment, in the midst of the unbearable silence, when all eyes were locked on Martin and Vanessa with contempt, the front door suddenly swung wide. A stream of light poured in from outside. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was me, George. I stepped inside, dressed in a tailored suit, walking tall and steady, carrying myself with an unusual calm and quiet resolve. Beside me was Andrew, my assistant, following closely with a briefcase in hand. I was not a man emerging from the kitchen, not someone just insulted and dismissed. I entered as though I had just come from an important board meeting, a high-level conference, not a family gathering, and I knew, from this moment on, everything would change. The game now belonged to me. I walked into the living room. Behind me, Andrew, the loyal assistant, still held that crucial briefcase. In that instant, every pair of eyes turned toward me. My appearance stood in absolute contrast to the image of a shabby servant in the kitchen, the way my own children and grandchildren had treated me. I was no longer the man bowing his head, obeying commands. This was George Miller, not old George, the useless one. The silence in the room was like glass, reflecting the astonishment etched across every face, shock, disbelief, and awe laid bare. Immediately, CEO Victoria rose to her feet. She stepped toward me with a look of deep respect so different from the way she had treated Martin and Charles. Extending her hand, her voice solemn and deliberate, she said, "Mr. Miller, it's an honor to meet you. I've been waiting a long time for this moment. At last, we have the chance to speak directly." Her words rang out with clarity and authority in the suffocating silence of the room, like a thunderclap in Martin and Vanessa's ears. The entire living room erupted in murmurs. This time they weren't mocking or scornful, but filled with sheer astonishment. Who exactly is Mr. George? Why would the CEO of such a major corporation treat him like that? Is he the real power here all along? Their eyes shifted away from Martin and Charles, the ones who had so proudly proclaimed themselves the pillars, and fixed on me with absolute shock. They struggled to piece together the events that had just unfolded, Martin's arrogant boasts, and my unexpected presence. Their expressions shifted from initial disbelief to genuine panic. Charles, Vanessa's grandfather, who had just been lounging in the seat of honor bragging about fabricated achievements, now stared down at the floor. The prestige and pride he had worked so hard to project collapsed in an instant. He avoided every gaze, his face flushed with humiliation. His shoulders hunched as if he wished he could sink into the very chair he had so proudly claimed as a symbol of distinction only minutes earlier. Charles, the hypocrite, had been laid bare in the most humiliating way. Martin was frozen, his face drained of all color, as pale as paper. Sweat gathered across his forehead and his lips trembled uncontrollably, unable to form a single word. His eyes locked on me, not with arrogance anymore, but with shock and a bone-deep fear. He realized his entire scheme had unraveled, that he had made a disastrous mistake. Martin felt as though every disdainful glance, every muffled laugh in the room was piercing straight through the glittering facade he had tried to build. This humiliation was far worse than any scolding. Vanessa stood beside him, forcing a weak smile but unable to say a word. Her face revealed nothing but bitter embarrassment, her eyes red and stinging with humiliation. Every effort she had made to elevate her family, to put on a show of elegance, had burst like a soap bubble. She wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Victoria turned to address everyone. Her voice was not raised, yet it reverberated through the entire room full of admiration and sincerity, without the slightest trace of pretense. It was no one else but the wise decisions and strategic vision of Mr. George Miller. Even though he stepped back from direct management to serve as senior advisor, he remains our ultimate counsel, the guiding hand that has steered Pinnacle Group to the secure and brilliant success it enjoys today. He is, without question, a legend in this industry. I calmly placed the thick file on the table, right where Martin and Charles had just been boasting arrogantly about achievements that weren't theirs. I didn't say much. I picked up my pen and signed the contract in the middle of the party, in front of everyone. Each stroke of my pen, each signature, was not just the completion of a multi-million-dollar business deal, but also a reaffirmation of my worth, my position, and the seal of a new chapter in my life. The CEO's assistant's camera flash went off repeatedly, capturing this historic moment, the moment when the truth was laid bare in its starkest form. The room remained silent, not a sound except the scratch of my pen and the click of the camera. Everyone was witnessing the unvarnished truth. When I finished signing, I lifted my head. My gaze was no longer as calm as when I had entered. Now it carried an invisible weight, an uncompromising clarity. I turned directly to CEO Victoria and gave her a slight nod. "Mrs. Victoria," I said, my voice steady, clear, and full of authority, echoing across the room and drawing everyone's attention to me. "I believe this project marks a turning point. However, when it comes to execution, I think we need to entrust it to someone truly deserving, someone with the capability and vision to lead, not someone who merely relies on connections or flashy appearances." Then I turned to look straight at Martin, my son. My eyes were calm but heavy with meaning, a warning, and a deep disappointment. "I am your father, not your servant, and work must be given to those who understand the value of true dedication, not to those who only know how to show off." Martin lowered his head. His lips trembled uncontrollably, stripped of all arrogance and bravado. He couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes, nor could he utter a word in reply. Humiliation and regret bound him like shackles. And I knew this was only the beginning of a change, not just in his life, but in mine as well. My words still lingered in the air, like a suspended verdict hanging over Martin, Vanessa, and even Charles. "I am your father, not your servant." Martin kept his head bowed, unable to look up. The silence in the room grew heavier than ever, suffocating, with not a single soul daring to speak. The party finally ended in awkwardness and disgrace. One by one, the guests left. The room no longer carried its false glamour. Instead, it was filled with shock and puzzled glances. They looked at me, then at Martin and Charles, curious, judgmental, as if finally glimpsing the real story of this family, a story long hidden. When the last guests had gone, only Martin, Vanessa, Charles, and I remained in the empty living room. Martin hesitated, then slowly stepped toward me, his shoulders trembling. His voice was barely audible, thick with fear and remorse, like a child caught doing wrong. "Father, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'm so sorry." The apology came too late after all the years of endurance, but it was the words I had long awaited. They were no longer arrogant words, only fragments of a broken pride. Vanessa stood silently behind Martin, her face lowered to the ground, hiding her shame and humiliation. She didn't dare lift her head to face me. I knew they had recognized their mistakes, but whether that recognition was enough to change anything, or merely the regret of losing a potential ace, remained to be seen. I stood tall. My face was composed, but my eyes held an unshakable resolve. I looked directly at Martin, then at Vanessa. "If you want to preserve this relationship," I said, my voice neither angry nor reproachful, yet weighty with finality, "start with showing respect to your father. That is the only thing I ask, and the very thing you have denied me for so many years. If not," I paused, letting my words sink deeply into them, "I will walk away, and we will have nothing more to do with each other." It was not a threat, but a declaration of a new boundary of my dignity. In the corner of the room, old Charles still sat alone on the once-honored chair that had now lost all meaning. He was no longer the center of attention. No one cared for him anymore. His power, his pride, were gone, leaving only a lonely, lost old man, forced to face a bitter truth. Before leaving, CEO Victoria still turned back. She sought me out and called to me once more, her voice still filled with respect. "See you again, boss." The look in her eyes, admiration and deference, echoed through the entire room, making Martin, Vanessa, and Charles bow their heads, even lower in shame. Those words, the way she addressed me, underscored the irreversible shift in my standing. I had returned, not just with a title, but with recognition from those who truly had the power to judge. I turned my back on the room, on the faces full of regret and shame, the same people who had once looked down on me. I climbed the stairs and went straight into my room. Only minutes later, I came back out with a small suitcase and a briefcase. That was all I needed. I had no intention of reclaiming this house or any of the possessions. The money I had given Martin to buy this home, to build his company, I had given freely as a lesson he had long forgotten, along with his roots. I set the suitcase by the door and pulled an envelope from the pocket of my coat. "This is for you," I said to Martin, my voice calm, without the slightest tremor. I placed the letter on the glass table in the middle of the room, right beside the freshly signed Pinnacle contract. "Read it." Martin picked up the letter, his hands trembling. He opened it. I didn't need to wonder about the contents, I had written them myself. It was a farewell. The letter spoke of respect, of human dignity, and of how I had grown weary of endless dinners and endless insults. It reminded Martin that true success cannot be built on arrogance and ingratitude. He read every word, his face turning pale, then gradually flushing red. Tears began to roll down his cheeks. He collapsed, his sobs breaking out in the hollow room, the sound of remorse, of loss. Vanessa rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him, and she too began to weep, tears of belated regret streaming down. Charles, seated in the far corner, stared blankly into the void, his aged face carved with helplessness. Watching Martin cry, I felt no more anger, only regret and a deep sorrow. Yet I knew this was the path I had to take. I turned away, picked up the suitcase and the briefcase. I opened the front door. A cold wind rushed in from outside, carrying the scent of dry leaves, of nightfall, and of a new beginning, one without them. I stepped out. The door closed behind me with a soft but final click, like the period at the end of a long sentence of endurance. It left behind a brightly lit but empty living room, echoing only with Martin and Vanessa's sobs. I walked away, never looking back. I reached the waiting taxi at the gate. The autumn wind brushed gently past. My heart felt strangely light, as though I had shed the heavy burden of years of silent suffering, years of insults. What I felt now was release, freedom. I was no longer the man confined to the kitchen or the corner table. I was George Miller, and I had reclaimed my place. I smiled softly, a peaceful, contented smile, one I hadn't worn in years. I raised the glass of wine in my hand, not to toast anyone, not to celebrate victory, but to mark an important moment in my life, the moment I won back my freedom and the dignity that had long been stolen. This was the beginning of a new life, a life I would live for myself, with the full respect and worth I had always deserved. And that was how one chapter of my life came to a close, just as another was quietly beginning. I still remember the sound of that heavy wooden door shutting behind me. It wasn't just a door closing. It was the echo of years of sacrifice, of silence, of unspoken wounds being sealed away. I didn't turn back that night. Not because my heart had grown cold, not because I no longer cared, but because I understood something deep in my bones. There are moments in life when you must walk forward without looking over your shoulder. Some lessons cannot be borrowed from books or passed down from others. They must be endured, lived, and carved into the soul. Some boundaries, if you want them to matter, you must draw with your own trembling hands. For years I had been like a shadow in my own home, reduced to the role of a servant within walls I once painted with love and laughter. I cooked, I cleaned. I obeyed unspoken rules that placed me beneath the very children I had raised. And yet, through those long seasons of quiet humiliation, I discovered something no one could take from me. I learned a truth more precious than gold. A human being's worth is never determined by the labels, the roles, or the dismissive glances others may throw upon them. True worth lives in the quiet strength of dignity, dignity held onto like a fragile flame in the dark. It lives in the unbroken spirit that chooses to rise again, no matter how many times it has been stepped on. That night, as I walked away, I carried no suitcase, no photographs, no trinkets of memory, only that fragile flame of dignity. It was small, but it was mine. And I promised myself, never again would I allow anyone to define my place. Never again would I let myself be buried in silence. Martin and Vanessa. Perhaps it will take them a long time to understand that. Martin's tears that night, I believe they were real. His regret, I believe that too. But was it regret over losing his trump card? Or regret over losing his father? I don't know. Yet I hope those tears were the beginning of a true change in their hearts, a change born out of an awakening to respect. In this life, we so often chase after glittering illusions, empty reputations, and shallow honors, forgetting the core values and the people who sacrificed quietly for us. I once stood at the height of success, only to fall into the pit of contempt. But it was those very moments of humiliation that sharpened me, that made me realize the most important thing isn't what others think of you, it's living true to your own nature and your own dignity. I believe each of us carries our own story, our own endless meal at the family table, where at some point we may have been dismissed, overlooked, or forgotten. But I want you to know this: the right to be respected belongs to everyone, no matter their age or circumstance. Never lose your voice. Never let anyone strip away the dignity that you rightfully deserve. Be strong, be steady, and wait for your moment. And you, the one listening to my story, are you perhaps living through your own version of such a family meal? Or is there someone in your life, maybe an elder, whose value you are unintentionally overlooking? Take a moment to reflect on that, because sometimes a single word, a single gesture of respect is enough to change an entire life. Thank you for listening to my story.